This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Solutions, the leading iGaming PAM platform with a modular approach, including many benefits like a fast, secure, and scalable API-based platform, integrated with all major third-party products and services. Make sure you head over to Pragmatic Solutions and join our smart thinking.
Bingo, bango, bongo. Vested Interest, episode number 4. We are live. Lloyd, Benjie, great to have you guys back, my fellow partners here. And Paris Smith, great to have you here as a guest today. Former CEO, of course, of Pinnacle, and since 2 months ago, an advisor to the industry. First and foremost, how are you today, Paris?
I am fantastic. Loving my new life.
Yeah, I would love to ask about that, actually. How has these couple of months been for you? You know, you were the CEO for 17 years or something like this for Pinnacle? Something along those lines?
Yeah.
How does it feel to not open the inbox in the morning and having to deal with fires and everything?
It took a minute to adjust to it, but honestly, it's really opened up my view of everything. You know, there's so many things that I realized I was putting myself in, you know, just that total focus on Pinnacle. I missed a lot of really cool stuff, quite honestly. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a massive adjustment, but I'm really settling in nicely to it.
Right. What's your focus now moving forward? Do you want to get back into kind of a CEO position? I mean, you're doing advisory stuff now, but where do you see yourself now moving forward? I mean, you must learn a lot from this, just being outside of the CEO.
Yeah. I think, you know, that's not the plan to go back into a CEO role, but you never know. I think that, you know, what I'm looking for is really just to help people within the industry from a strategic perspective. There's, you know, when you've been around as long as I have, 17 years, Pinnacle, 11 years with WWTS, it's, I've learned a lot. And, you know, it doesn't make sense for people to make the same mistakes that I had. So if I can add any value, you know, I'm really excited to do so. But I have to add value. I can't just show up. That's not fun.
Fair enough. And by the way, will all of us, I'm assuming now that we all will be at G2E next month, right? In October.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Lloyd, you mentioned that there's a pretty busy event schedule here now coming up. Like you're traveling left, right, and center here in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, at the time of recording here, we got the EGR event out in Laguna Beach, which is always a great setting for an event with some good intimate conversations. You got SBC Barcelona about a week and a half, 2 weeks from now, and then G2E in Las Vegas. It's a crowded calendar. I think there's a Sigma event at some point. There's probably some others that haven't even mentioned, but the summer is now officially over, I guess. Labor Day is sort of the unofficial/official end to summer, especially here in the US. And now everyone, you know, is back in their inboxes, except Paris, I guess, putting out those fires and finalizing those travel plans to all these upcoming conferences. But it should be great. Always good to be in cool places with good friends and talking business and also having a little bit of fun.
Amazing. Benjie, what about you? Like, where will we see you on the circuit?
The next one for me, believe it or not, will be G2E, and I know we're going to be talking about that momentarily. I just want to comment, Pierre. You know,
nice.
last month on the podcast we had Jeffrey Haas. This time we have Paris. You're bringing out all the big wigs, so I don't know who we're going to be able to bring on board to join us next time, but Paris will be a tough act to follow, so looking forward to sharing some thoughts here. And congratulations, Paris, on the 17 years at Pinnacle, where we crossed paths many times, and look forward to collaborating on other things going forward.
Yeah, we've certainly gone out on a high note here at the Vested Interest podcast. We'll try to keep the level up, that's for sure. And by the way, speaking of G2E, I don't know if you guys saw did you see the news today in Vegas? So it was like yesterday with MGM, like the hack that is taking place at MGM at the moment. Crazy stuff, right? People can't get into their rooms.
I heard a rumor, and I have no idea if this is true, that the same group had targeted Caesars maybe the week before, and perhaps Caesars might have paid the ransom right away, and MGM resisted. And what we've seen is the fallout of the cyber attackers, you know, showing you what happens when you don't pay the ransom. I don't know if that's the case, but yeah, I saw mobile keys were not working. No one could check in. I think ATMs were not working. I think some of the slot machines were down across several of the properties for a period yesterday. So very eager to see how this all gets sorted out. But it's an interesting time. There also was that case from Circa a couple of weeks ago where someone successfully basically tricked someone in the cages to believe that I think like the CEO's personal assistant was coming down to take out $1 million to go make some emergency payment. And I'm pretty sure someone walked right into the cages and said, "Hi, I'm Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so here for my money." And they handed over, I think, close to $1 million, which, again, terrible. But there's a cleverness there that you almost have to, I guess, briefly laugh at.
Right. Yeah, we talked about this earlier on the pod, right? It was like some sophisticated attacks against you, Lloyd, and Benjie as well. Not always that easy to notice these days. Hard stuff. But yeah, nonetheless, we have G2E in front of us. Always a staple in the calendar, of course. One of the biggest conferences in the world in our industry. Just something that I've noticed now, especially last year, is that online is taking a bigger and bigger part in G2E, and more of the European segment are now traveling over to the G2E conference. I don't know, like, if we look at what your expectations are for this year, what would you say? Like, Paris, starting with you, do you get this feeling as well that online is taking more of a place at G2E, and what's your expectations on the event this year?
Yeah, it's very, very noticeable that it is becoming, well, for me, it's more dominant because I don't really pay attention to the land-based stuff. So
Right.
I was like, wow, there's a lot of land-based here, not really appreciating that was the basis of the conference. But yeah, and it's really become a massive, massive networking opportunity. And as you said, there are a number of European operators that are coming over. And I think that's great because to understand the US gaming environment is so important. So, but yeah, it's interesting, and I think the biggest thing is the networking. Like you don't even have to. You don't have to set up. I very rarely set up meetings, and then I get there and I'm busy from 8 a.m. to 2 in the morning. So it's just like all the right people go. It's a great flow, and I personally love that conference.
Yeah, do you feel that sometimes these like major conferences, like ICE, G2E, it's like 30-minute meetings, one after the other. You have 10 per day, and it's like a competition who can have most meetings. Sometimes I feel a little bit like, what's the difference of having a digital meeting if you're not going to like get closer to people? Like they can become a bit impersonal, these like massive shows. I don't know really. Sometimes I feel like maybe it's not the right strategy to go after like bam, 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 meeting. Is there like a better way to do it?
Well, I mean, that's my whole point. I try not to go meeting. It just naturally flows because all the right people are there. But yeah, I think that meeting frenzy, it does take away. It's just like ice. But the way G2E is set up, I always find that, you can go beyond that 30 minutes. And there is that flexibility, more so than some of the other conferences.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Benjie,
and I definitely appreciate. Yeah, no, I appreciate certainly what that whirlwind can feel like, and I do appreciate how certainly sometimes when you have these stacked back-to-back meetings, it feels very transactional almost. You both exchange some niceties, you do a little bit of small talk, and then you each kind of try to get into your respective sales pitches or whatever it is. But with that said, I think, especially for really meaningful commercial deals and investments and partnerships that will involve long-term relationships, there's no substitute for in-person meetings. I think you develop a bond and a level of trust with people when you meet face to face that is often difficult to replicate digitally. There are tons of day-to-day meetings that you have in the course of running your business that absolutely you can totally do on a digital basis. But when the goal is to forge a deeper relationship and bond with someone and get to the point where they feel like you guys are, you would enjoy working with each other on a sustained basis with a lot of money at stake, I just don't know if there is any substitute for in-person. And to Paris's point, what sets G2E apart from, I think, all the other great conferences that, of course, exist is everyone is in the same place at the same time. All the people you could possibly need or want to meet with are probably all in Las Vegas at one of 3 different hotels over that same period. And so there's just no substitute for that.
Benjie, how do you maximize this conference? And how would you say, like, if you compare it to the EGR, for example, smaller show, more personal, you can get closer into people and get more friendship. Like, what do you get most out of, like EGR or G2E, for example?
You really can't compare it. It's apples to oranges. Like, the EGR is really all about not so much business networking, but just building relationships with people and getting to know people on a more personal basis, because you're hanging out over a few day period and having dinners together and bonding and spending time and not necessarily just discussing business. Whereas you look at an ICE or a G2E, it's got a bit more of a speed dating aspect to it, where you're half an hour here to a half an hour there. And, look, we talk about the online gaming versus land-based. G2E has transformed itself. It's still got, obviously, majority of land-based components. But I remember back 10 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, G2Es in Vegas. And, these wouldn't be a conference I would be traveling to, except that I was based in Vegas, so I would go down and check it out. But it was entirely land-based. There was no iGaming components at all. Like, it just didn't exist. And then those first couple of years, there was a small component when a couple of sport radars and whatnot began investigating the US and would come down. But it was really almost entirely land-based. And the other thing that I'm really looking for when it comes to G2E is the M&A piece. And I think back to, I think it'll be 5 years ago will be the anniversary as to when my company was acquired. But there was a very strategic component on behalf of Scientific Games, I guess now Light and Wonder, at that time, that they wanted to make the announcement that they were acquiring Don Best and come out with that news with a big press release the morning of G2E. And they were very deliberate about it to make a splash. And since then, we've seen that every year, right? That there's always announcements of some sort regarding M&A that correspond with day one or the day before or day two. It's deliberate and it's intentional. And I think we'll see it again this year in some capacity.
Yeah, interesting. We'll have to wait and see how Joy.
Yeah, no, I think there will be, I would guess, more M&A conversations during the week of G2E than potentially any previous G2E conference. On the sell side, you just have more companies in the space than ever before, and many of them have had to tamper their expectations for exit opportunities and done so in a way that is quite favorable to acquirers. And on the buy side, you got the public companies in the space finally showing profitability. Stock prices are up. Inflation and interest rate concerns seem to be at bay, at least for now. And I find most of the big operators, as well as suppliers and media companies, have really honed in on very specific objectives that they want to target by way of M&A as opposed to organic growth. And then on top of that, I certainly know of at least a few, both domestic and international players who have never attended a G2E conference before, but will be attending with checkbooks open, looking for routes to get into the market, and quite deep-pocketed checkbooks as well. And so who knows how many actual transactions will arise or what the dollar value of those transactions will be. But if there was a way to count it, I would bet there will be more preliminary M&A conversations and kicking the tire type meetings at this year's G2E than probably any one perhaps ever.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but you'll definitely find me if you want to take meetings in the center of the casino floor at Venetian at the excellent Goldfish 3 slot machines, by the way, by Maxi. Fantastic machines. That's my highlight of every G2E. But moving on from one subject to the other, Benjie, in the preparation of this episode today, we were talking about a couple of different points to bring up in the conversation, and you brought up an interesting point here on the outlook of fantasy, which traditionally is not part of the conversations here within our industry, but it's obviously some pretty heavy overlap here. So I'm gonna hand over the mic to you a little bit more to introduce this topic and perhaps raise the points that you want today. So, Benjie, we'll go back a little bit. I think you have put yourself on mute.
Sorry about that, guys. I'll come back right now. Sorry, I was on mute for a second. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Pierre. No, when I was talking to you and to Lloyd and now to Paris about this, I just feel as though we've seen a lot of action within the fantasy space in terms of launches in recent weeks. And, look, we all know that you have some players in the space that are fairly sizable when you talk about companies like Prize Picks and Underdog, which obviously has a sportsbook component as well. But I think a lot of us were, I don't want to say caught off guard because but I think a lot of us were intrigued by the launch of Better into the space, Mojo into the space. On a smaller level, we've seen Chalkboard now come in, and I think there's others forthcoming. And we saw the announcement as well with Boom Fantasy and kind of their acquisition on the NBC front and making a bigger play on their end into the vertical. And I think it's kind of begs the question as to whether or not this is, becoming a vertical in and of itself, and also to what extent investor interest will reemerge in this space despite some of the regulatory headwinds and challenges that we've seen in the past facing this piece of the industry. And when you think of the sports betting space and you think of the iGaming space, it's not just about sports betting, just about casino. It's about real money gaming and what all that means. And there's other dynamics within as such. And where does lottery fit in? And where does iLottery fit in? But I think that, the daily fantasy or daily fantasy 2.0, as many people like to call it, is becoming a dynamic that we're seeing a number of players move into because there's some opportunity and promise there.
Fair enough. Do you see, but it almost feels like there's like the return of fantasy here in some ways, where the traditional operators that come from the sports betting background, like FanDuel and DraftKings, when PASPA happened and kind of companies refocused into online. We are seeing now, as you mentioned, companies like Better, for example, going the other way, where they are refocusing from sports betting into fantasy. Is this like... is this a play, do you think, as well, from some operators to find profitability due to the fact that it's just a difficult, like sports betting is just difficult?
Well, it's less expensive from once, look. Sorry, go ahead, Paris.
Well, I was just going to say, I think what I always find interesting being a relic in the industry is everything comes back around. Sports books were very against having a poker or a casino. And then at the end of the day, it's like everybody needs to make money. You need to maximize your funnel of people coming in. And, whether it be you're a sports book and you do fantasy or sweepstakes, whatever it might be, you almost at this stage of the game, with the cost of business increasing, you need to have as many avenues as possible, or different revenue streams, different verticals, if you will. So if you can have your fantasy that can be in a state that there's that ability to offer fantasy, you go there, you have your presence, and then when they do regulate for casino or for sports betting, then you can transition those players into your other betting options that you have available. So I think it's like part of the long game strategic goal where you have to have a plethora of options in order to...
Isn't there a risk, especially for tier 2 operators in this space, that they end up spreading themselves thin with this type of strategy, Paris?
100%. Well, it doesn't work for everybody, incidentally. But
right, it's hyper competitive.
Of that US market where, you have to differentiate, you have to offer everything. Is micro betting the next greatest thing? Well, everybody has to have it because, everybody's kind of chasing certain things. And I think, if you don't have it, you might be missing out. So people are focusing on trying to get as many things as possible. But exactly to your point, once you do start spreading yourself too thin, then that becomes problematic. Unless if let's just say Pinnacle, if Pinnacle had, let's go into poker. Pinnacle can't go into poker. Pinnacle needs a strategic partner in poker. Pinnacle will need a strategic partner in sweepstakes or in all these different things. So that's where a little bit about what Lloyd's talking about, all these conversations, whether it be M&A or strategic partnerships, those are going to be happening at G2E.
But I'll say this as it pertains to the fantasy topic, is it's not as though, Paris, we're seeing a scenario where all of the bigger operators are now focusing on this form of fantasy 2.0 or daily fantasy 2.0. Yes, we've seen Better come into this segment. Look, I think a lot of them are looking at Prize Picks and seeing rumored to be astronomical numbers, significant numbers that they're doing in terms of handle and in terms of EBITDA, and seeing it as a real opportunity. And I think that a lot of these same entities view sportsbook as a really, really difficult path. So for Mojo, that again, I don't know the specifics of your strategy, and I haven't had any conversations with anyone there. I think they view the path to launching a fantasy product and going nationwide or almost nationwide with fantasy as being a lot easier to do and easier to accomplish, and an easier route to meaningful revenue than going down a sportsbook track.
Lloyd, just jumping over to you here. What do you feel? Do you feel there's like the kind of return of fantasy here as well? And also just Benjie, you mentioned that perhaps it is easier to succeed in the fantasy landscape, but isn't there also an added challenge here, which is that you need the liquidity in order to kind of create that flywheel, if you will, in this product? So just Lloyd, over to you first. Is it easier? Is it really easier to succeed in this vertical? And what do you think as well in general? Do we see the kind of return here?
So first of all, about whether this is the return or things are coming back around. Most of the most successful companies were not the first ones to do the thing them for doing. They just were the first ones to do it in the right way or at the right time. Google was not the first search engine, but they were the first ones to index and use their page rank algorithm in the way that they did. Uber was not the first ride-hailing app, but it was the first that really hit critical mass at a time when everyone had mobile-enabled devices in their pockets at all times. And so whether it's sweepstakes or fantasy or stock market-like products, just because some of them may have failed in the past or even recently, I never necessarily think that means they are doomed to the same fate now. I think there's an interesting double-edged sword about the decreased barriers to entry that these DFS 2.0 or DFS Plus or fixed odds fantasy or single player fantasy, all different names I've heard used to describe these companies. On the one hand, it's great for what is very much at the heart of entrepreneurship, which is this idea that you release a minimally viable product and you take feedback from your users and the market and you iterate. And that is much easier to do in the less regulatorily burdensome arena of daily fantasy than it is in the more regulatorily burdensome arena of sportsbooks and casinos. But on the flip side, the regulatory burden and the process you need to go through to get licensed also ends up filtering out certain types of companies and management teams that often give rise to some challenges. And so in addition to the fact that the space is now very crowded, Underdog and Prize Picks, they have, made their bed for themselves and are in quite a compelling position. But for new entrants, they're not only going up against, call it the pure play DFS companies, but the Mojos and the Betters of the world. And I'm telling you, you're about to see a whole bunch of esports and Web3 play to earn companies that are now going to be releasing pick'em DFS games as well. And that's quite crowded. And I also think maybe a less discussed or less focused on challenge, in addition to the potential regulatory headwinds, and one that might exacerbate those, are what I'll describe as maybe some of the pressure I'm started to notice at the seams here. There are two companies I'm aware of that you can find on Twitter people are currently complaining about in this DFS space as not being willing to process withdrawals and potentially being in the process of shutting down accounts. There are two other companies in the space that, although they have really highly regarded investors on their cap table, most people I know believe are falsifying their numbers and their metrics in a way that will probably likely come home to roost at some point. And then while we are seeing people pivot into this DFS 2.0 space, we're also seeing some others pivot out of it or add on a B2B white label angle to their originally B2C based products. So look, Prize Picks and Underdog, fantastic businesses. The numbers they're outputting are amazing. Their products are great. Sleeper, you might also put up in that category. But once you get down to the tier 2, tier 3s within this space, I think it's going to be tough unless you really have a reason to be there and a differentiating angle. I'll give a shout out. I don't want to name any of the companies that I express challenges regarding, but a shout out to two young entrepreneurs and companies that I do think are doing great. Parlay Play, which I know Benjie is friendly with Florence, and another called Units, run by a founder named Tori, who was previously at WSC. These are some small DFS 2.0 companies that have an incredible focus on product and the consumer, and that I've been a big fan of the way that they're going about their businesses, and I certainly hope both of them succeed to quite a great extent. But for all the reasons I just mentioned, I do think that while we might see a few unicorns minted from this space, it's the ones that have been in the game for quite a while. I do think it is very challenging to be a new entrant in the DFS 2.0 space today.
Yeah, Benji, just back to you here. Like, how do you succeed as a new entry today? Let's say, take Better, for example. They have announced that they are launching a sports bet, DFS product. When they are up against, say, underdog who is pouring in millions in promotional spend to their players, just based on the fact that they have so much liquidity already. It's like that networking effect, right? They have so much liquidity that they are able to carry these like massive promotions. Like, how do you compete against that as a new entry?
Look, if you're talking about Better specifically, as we know, their strategy is really geared to their internal media company, their internal engine of generating their own users, and obviously, in this instance, they can go nationwide or close to it as opposed to focusing on individual states. I don't know that I agree with Lloyd here. I don't know that, I think that if we fast forward 5, 6, 7 years from now, or even 2 or 3 years from now, it may not be a 2-horse race. It may be a 4, 5, 6, 7-horse race. Just as in sportsbook, you always will have a top 1 or a top 2, but you have a bunch of others that are still very capable. And I think that we'll see that emerge within this fantasy segment as well, if the legislative headwinds allow it such. But, I don't know that I would view it as a crowded space yet. I would say that you had 2 companies that have had the lion's share, and to Lloyd's point, a couple of smaller emerging companies that people haven't even heard of mostly when it comes to parlay play and units and some of the others. Most people aren't familiar with them, yet these are companies that are doing some pretty hefty numbers and growing at a nice pace. And now you have companies that have some form of financial metal behind them and ability to raise capital when you look at the Mojos and the Betters, and some established user base and some pedigree in terms of the way in which they operate their businesses. And I think that we could see 1 or more of these companies become a major player within this vertical. So I don't know. I'm of the view that we're still in early days there, that it is not an overcrowded space, but an undercrowded space in an area where there's a lot of appetite and a lot of opportunity.
Fair enough. Paris, finishing thoughts from your end here. What do you think? How's this space going to turn out? Will we have like one big winner, as we see in some other tech verticals, where you have one kind of platform at top, or do you see that the space can cater for many different players here in the tier 1 on the DFS space?
I agree more with Benjie, where I think that, again, being in my bubble of sports betting, when I realized what that sweepstakes market was doing and the fantasy market, I was like, oh, I was caught off guard by it. But it is still growing, and there is a lot of, I think that there's going to be some late bloomers coming in and grow. The numbers, the increase in numbers that people have month over month is incredible right now. And I think that they're going to find small differentiators that haven't even been created as yet. And then that will broaden it out and bring some people to the forefront of it.
Brilliant, Paris. You were the tiebreaker here, and I'm happy to announce that Benji took the win in this argument. Sorry so much, Lloyd. You have to give this one up, unfortunately, I'm afraid. Moving on to the third topic here today. Last time in the third episode of Vested Interest, we talked about the lies that startup founders tell investors in the investment process. Really interesting conversation here. And we were thinking today to kind of flip the conversation around a bit and talk a little bit about traps that startup founders should avoid when seeking investment. Perhaps Benji, you want to kick it off here a little bit. You talk to founders, obviously on a recurring basis here. What do you see as the kind of main traps that founders tend to fall into when they are seeking investment, and what do they need to do to avoid those traps?
Yeah, I think one of the traps, look, I was looking at somebody had approached me last week, and I was reading through their deck before getting on a call, and this was a company that's really at their very early stages and coming out with a really big number on their valuation straight in the deck, which just stood out like a red flag in a major way. And I think one of the traps that that founders often fall into, we all tend to overvalue our own worth and our own companies and where we're at in our trajectory in that regard. And, I think that for founders in those early stages, one of the traps would be when they come out and pinpoint themselves at a certain valuation and then need to go out and either raise capital and approaching investors or try and live up to that. And I think when you come out with something that's unrealistic out of the gates, which is often the case, it becomes a little bit more difficult to backpedal rather than if they were to just come out. And in many instances, I think that the founder would be in a much better spot if they didn't even establish a valuation when they were coming out and approaching investors in the early stages, and simply come out and talk about what you need in terms of resource and capital to get where you're going. And then as you work alongside lead investors and VC firms, collectively you can come up with the appropriate metrics as to what the value of that company is. But I think that, when you're trying to establish it from the outset before having those conversations, oftentimes you're putting yourself into that trap when you don't need to.
Yeah, I agree. The way to do it is to say that you have a specific amount of money that you need to raise and that you're going to accomplish a specific set of milestones with that amount of money. And then you basically let the market decide, how much dilution you will have to incur in order to raise around that money. And I think Benjie's example is a prime example of a broader class of things that especially first-time founders often do that inadvertently signals either a lack of experience or a lack of credibility. Another example I would use is, asking for an NDA up front just to use a one-pager or a pitch deck. While you as a founder might think it's logical to do so, it'll very quickly signal to you that you've never done this before, because if you had, you would know that, no angel investor or VC is going to sign an NDA just to, do a 30-minute call. And so I think there's a whole bucket of inadvertent signals of inexperience that are probably some of the most common traps. Perhaps adjacent, or maybe you'd say even in that bucket as well, I often see founders not properly understand or interpret the feedback that they're getting, from a VC. When a VC says, "Come back to me when you have a lead investor," that's closer to a no, probably, than it is to a yes. And so I think if you're a founder and you talk to an investor and they say, "Come back to us when you have a lead," and then you talk to the next investor and say, "Oh, this investor I just talked to are planning on coming in once we secure a lead," and especially if those two investors are friends and, quickly send each other a text message to confirm, that is another type of thing. If you're an experienced founder, that almost every investor who doesn't want to make a decision yet tells you to come back when you have a lead and have the terms settled, unless they themselves are planning on putting forth a term sheet. So,
but Lloyd, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt here, but I mean, a lot of founders will not have the experience of raising capital, and they might have a great idea, and they might be great at running their business. I mean, now we're talking about the kind of the experience you get along the way, right? But like, how do you avoid this as a first time founder who is seeking investment for the first time? Do you scan your network and ask for this trap before? Because this is like micro type interactions that can signal the wrong thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your company is not solid, right? I mean, it's really difficult to avoid all of these small traps.
Sure. So the reality is that even a company that is operationally solid will need an incredible amount of fundraising prowess and tactfulness in order to successfully guide their company to the type of exit that a venture capital investor is looking for. And one of the biggest questions that I ask myself before making an investment, to distill a lot of this, is I ask myself, is this a founder whose earnings I want to own a future stake in, regardless of what they happen to be pitching me at the moment? And for me, part of what makes me say yes is when someone is what Paul Graham would call relentlessly resourceful. We live in an era of ChatGPT and the internet and Google and YouTube and podcasts. There are more hours of content from venture capitalists and startup founders showing people the ropes and the tips and tricks and what to avoid when fundraising than a person could ever listen to in 10 lifetimes. And so there isn't really an excuse, in my view, for not being resourceful and taking some of the time to educate yourself on those matters. Would anyone ever be expected to be perfect doing something they had never done before? Of course not. But if you're trying to bet on a founder to take an idea out of their head and turn it into a billion-dollar company, they're going to at least need to be resourceful enough to know that before embarking on major company endeavors like fundraising, to do any number of things. And it's not necessarily the same for each founder. Like you said, maybe some people have folks in their network they can go to and just say, hey, what are the 5 things that you wish you knew before you started fundraising? Many will not have, but the internet is such a vast resource. There are so many amazing books, podcasts, audiobooks, YouTube videos, I mean, probably TikTok videos at this point, you name it, that I almost think it is, I hate to use this word, but it is almost, I think, inexcusable to not avail yourself of the resources around you, especially when you're going to go out to an investor and say, hey, I need $5 million.
Right. So is it almost like founders are underestimating the fact that they are the product to some extent rather than just their company?
Not universally, but yes, I definitely think, that is part of it. When you're asking people to make an early stage bet, the less traction you have, the farther you are from generating free cash flow, the more it is the case that the founder or founding team is the entity on which the bet is being made, and therefore is the entity which has to inspire that level of belief and inspiration.
Fair enough. Just jumping over to Paris here, listening to these comments. What's your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I think it's interesting because I'm now, again, opening up my horizons here and
Right.
speaking to a lot of people. A lot of people come to me and, I don't know who they are. And they're like, hey, can you take a look at this? And the over-promising I find is a little bit interesting. And the lack of understanding of who their competitors are. A lot of times people are like, we have this brand new thing, nobody has it. And I'm like, well, there's probably about 30 companies that are doing it. And, and just that lack of understanding about what their actual competition is. As Lloyd said, it's inexcusable, but for the reason being, you can go to these conferences and you can go and talk to people and see what's out there. That's what's most advantageous about coming to the conferences, is seeing, what the competition is, how people are presenting themselves as well. But it's super interesting to me. I think that there are a lot of opportunities for people to link up. Years ago, I used to be so frustrated when, somebody's like, oh, so-and-so is going to invest in this company, data rights is my sore spot, and into this data rights. And I'm like, they don't understand, they're being told something and they're never going to make a profit because their market's not ready for it yet. So getting the full understanding of the ecosystem for specific areas, I think as well, is something that could really help these founders.
Benny, what's your thoughts
Some of
here?
these things, some of these things are a bit of a balancing act, right? Like, you want your startup founders, to Lloyd's point, to have done the research to a certain extent, for sure. And before you can put out a pitch deck to go pitch people, you want to get feedback from some people and get some views on it. But at some point, you got to take action and move the ball forward. And, if you're standing around waiting to make something happen, nothing's going to happen, right? So I think that you often have a trap where some founders are a little bit too slow in some instances, trying to get too much information before they take steps, trying to be too perfect, which they never will be, right? Whether it be with a pitch deck or whether it be with their product development. I'm not sure what the phrase is. Perfection is the enemy of whoever it's the enemy of. But it's true. Like, you got to get the ball rolling to get the ball rolling, right? And you're going to make mistakes when you're out there pitching investors for capital, when you're out there building your product. You're going to make mistakes along the way. It's never going to be as good as you want it to be or as it could be. So you got to it's a balancing act. To Lloyd's point, you got to do your homework. You got to listen to a few of those podcasts. You got to get as far enough along as you can within your levels of understanding of this industry and of what you're trying to do. And at the same time, you got to just dive into the pool sometimes, as opposed to just going 1 foot at a time, tippy-toeing to get wet.
It's interesting. Paris, you mentioned, a lot of people come to you and you get the feeling they aren't really well prepared or they don't understand. And one perhaps aspect in this is as well, like, how do you even get to the point of a meeting with an investor? And I was reading a really good book by Carl Newport called Deep Work. And he talks about, he gets a lot of people contacting him. They want his advice and they want to get in front of him. And he's really protective over his time. So he said in the book he talks about what's the best way to book a meeting with Carl Newport. And he says you should serve him in the meeting request by in the email, for example. Don't just ask like, oh, hey Carl, we have this great project. I would like to talk to you about this. Do you have any space available in your calendar? I can be flexible. That's kind of what tends to happen. Like you say, I can be flexible because, it shows that, I can work on your schedule and so on. But he talks about that it's even better to contact Carl Newport, be more specific what you want to talk about, include the agenda of the bullet points that you want to talk about, give him clarity so he doesn't need to guess what the meeting is going to be about. And then most importantly, instead of saying that you can be flexible with your time and meet his calendar, give 3 options directly in the calendar invite. Here are 3 times where I'm available. Because what that does to him is when he sees this email, he doesn't need to find a time, he doesn't need to reply, and here are 3 times that work for me and so on. He can just say yes or no in the email, and it makes it so much easier for him to just read the email, reply in 5 seconds, and then you have the meeting booked. So Lloyd, a question for you is, what's the best way to score a meeting with Lloyd Danzig as a first-time founder seeking investment?
I think, first of all, it's a great, I'm not familiar with the specific passage you're referring to. We'll definitely check it out. But it speaks to a topic that I sometimes hear people refer to as commercial empathy. Really putting yourself in the mind of the person you're trying to get a conversation with and understanding how to make a path of least resistance toward them getting on the phone with you. I know a founder who religiously, even if he didn't know where someone lived or was based, he would go out of his way to find where they were at the moment and always propose times via email in their local time zone, just so that they didn't even have to do the minor mental effort of converting time zones. And I think, I love that founder, and I loved when I observed that about him. And you can extrapolate that out to every way that he conducts types of outreach. And I love that kind of stuff. And I think that is the best generic advice. I think the other sort of generic advice that also is the answer for me is realistically, warm introductions are always the best way to go. Anytime Benjie has ever said to me, you should take a look at this company or you should talk to this founder, I think if nothing else, you'll enjoy the conversation. I have probably scheduled that call within 24 hours. And the same goes, for other highly respected, high signal quality people that I find in my network. One of the other, by the way, traps that I find founders falling into, which dovetails here, is that out of a genuine desire to move forward with as much urgency as possible, they accidentally put a string of decisions in place that results in what feels to investors like an overshopped deal, where they hire 5 different advisors that all are going to get a small piece of any money raised, and maybe 2 other brokers or some other type. And maybe they use HubSpot or some automated outreach system to email blast everyone on an email list that they purchase. And that is the opposite of getting a warm introduction, which I think pretty much everyone, investor or otherwise, prefers. And while, again, I really appreciate the desire to get at least a few calendar appointments scheduled so that you have the ball rolling and that you have some momentum, taking a sort of half-hearted, semi-automated bulk outreach approach as opposed to a methodical, targeted, relationship-based, warm intro-focused approach is a trap. And I think if you ask Benjie and Paris, they will probably also say, among other things, a warm introduction from a well-respected friend or colleague is always going to be the superior way to get any sort of meeting, not just investment-related.
Paris?
I mean, this is new space for me, to be honest. And what I'm loving watching is how open, at conferences and such, that people like Lloyd and then are with people and guiding them and helping them. Sometimes what I'm viewing, like as a just observer, is people they go two, like, like you're saying, they might have 4 or 5 people helping them, instead of just going to the conference and seeing what's there and trying to get these contacts, understand who is the right contact to help you get to the right people. It's always interesting to me to see and wonder, how did you find that person? I don't, not judging, but yeah, it's really fun to see. And the reality is, by having all these different conversations, it's really helping to vet if the product is going to be a successful product. As soon as the likes of Benjie and Lloyd and the other groups start really looking at products and they start talking about it, that can make or break a new product, a new company. It's interesting.
Right. Lloyd Danzig, we'll definitely keep that nickname in mind here for the future. Thank you for that,
Bert. I like it. Very regal sounding.
Fantastic. And another point I would like to bring up to you guys too is the point of dilution. How much do you want to dilute yourself as a founder? You might need to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, even further funding rounds. That's going to dilute your shareholding to the point where you are the founder, but you are maybe an insignificant part of the cap table. And just to nail this point down a little bit, I was, some of us here obviously were in Tallinn a couple of months ago to listen to the YOLO partner event, where we got to listen to one of the co-founders of Shazam. And he held a really, really great keynote that was talking about, how do you build a successful company against all odds, to never give up. And it was a fantastic keynote. Chris Barton was his name, by the way. And, I spoke to Chris afterwards because it struck me interesting that someone like him is doing keynotes from across the world. He is Silicon Valley based. The event was happening in Tallinn. Shazam sold to Apple for $400 million just 5 years ago, something like that. And I was suspecting, because they were a company that was founded in the end of the 90s, having to survive through the dot-com crash, that maybe they had to dilute themselves to the point where the exit wasn't actually that attractive to Chris. And it turned out to be the case, actually, in his case. He had a quite small stake in Shazam by the point the company exited. And even though he had built that company for 20 years, and Shazam is a household name that a majority of the global population knows, the exit for him was still not lucrative enough for him to retire, essentially, especially if you live in Silicon Valley. It's going to take a pretty significant exit, to be fair, but still, and that perhaps is a little bit of a trap that he found himself in. And so Benjie, just jumping over to you as well on the point of dilution as well. Is this something, when you look at cap tables of, I know that you're an early stage investor, but is this a concern perhaps to investors that are looking to invest in later rounds if the founder is not that a significant part of the cap table anymore?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Look, I was there as well in Tallinn. It was a fantastic keynote, and they did dilute the hell out of the guy. But, I think he still did okay on the exit. It's all relative, right? There's no right or wrong when it comes to dilution. But for sure, if I'm a late stage investor, more at the, looking at a Series A or a Series B, which typically I don't look at, to be perfectly honest. But if I were, and the founder were already massively diluted beyond the regular norms, far beyond those standard regular norms, then it does present as a red flag in terms of adding an additional capital as to how motivated will that founder be and how much control does that founder have. And all those dynamics need to be considered when you're looking at investment. But I think when you look at it from the founder's perspective in the early stages, there is no right or wrong. The best way to minimize dilution is to bootstrap and get as far enough along as you can without requiring other people's capital. But often when you're bootstrapping, how do you bootstrap? You pick up, get a group that to help you with your tech development for equity. So you're bootstrapping, but you're giving up equity anyhow, right? So there really is no right or wrong when it comes to that equation. What I would say is that ensuring that when it comes to the investment piece in those early stages, that you're surrounding yourself, to the extent possible, with like-minded investors who see your opportunity in a similar lens to how you see your opportunity, will go a long ways, even if it means a little bit more dilution. Not all capital is created equally, and having quote unquote dumb money or non-strategic capital that won't help you build your story, that won't help you attract additional capital for your next round, et cetera, at a better valuation for you as a founder versus getting investment from people like a Paris or a Lloyd or whomever else at maybe a slightly worse valuation. Bringing in that strategic capital often makes sense, even if it means more dilution. But there's no right or wrong when it comes to that. It's all a question of individual founder and their individual situation.
I have a question.
Fair enough. Yeah, go ahead, Paris.
And Lloyd, like, do you feel like the founders, they're coming to look, in many cases, it's a case of, okay, if you want to hold on to your equity or percentage, then you're going to have a lot of nothing. Or if you get the right partners, you can have a little bit of a bigger piece, right? Do you find that that's the case or not necessarily?
I definitely think that that's the right way to think about it. Getting the right partners and capital on board, especially out of the gate, it can change your entire trajectory, not just your launch point, but the slope of your launch and how quickly you will be ascending in the future. And I always advise founders, although admittedly it's much easier to say as the investor, that they should optimize not for dilution, but for having the right stakeholders around the table. I think it all goes back to Benjie's point, which is especially at the early stage, if you're aligned with your investors and you have good open communication and a good working relationship, and after 2 or 3 years of really hard working, you're actually starting to get worried about how your dilution over future rounds might impact your level of incentivization, well, presumably the first lead investor you brought on board is on your board of directors, and it is not ultra common, but fairly common for the board to agree to give founders some extra options, some extra equity, some extra incentives to make sure that they stay ultra motivated over time. And so I think if you combine Benjie and Paris's points here, aligning yourself with the right strategic stakeholders with whom you are on the same page, and to use a phrase that I know Benjie likes, which I always appreciate, which is, all rowing in the same direction, I think that helps solve a lot of these problems. If you take money from a sort of, no-name, semi-anonymous firm that you don't have a good relationship with, and you don't make good on the obligations you agreed to in your funding agreement, and then it comes time for the next round, that probably, I think, will not work out quite as favorably. So there's no right or wrong. There's no obvious answer. At the end of the day, every founder has to do whatever the best is that they can achieve within their means and within their network. But there's no question that taking on a little extra dilution or even a lot of extra dilution in the early days from the right party can dramatically increase the size of the pie that even a smaller percentage of results in a larger absolute return for.
Benjie, final point here.
Look, I think that I would agree with all of those points that were made. I'd love to find something to disagree with there, but I think it does come down to the individual investor and what their appetite is. And, as we said all along, but I agree with something that Lloyd said earlier struck with me also, which is when you have the investors that are, or the advisors, the founders who are working with a number of different groups to help them attract capital, it tends to bring in like a lower quality dynamic. If you're throwing all the macaroni against the wall for one piece to stick, usually it's not that highest quality piece, so to speak. So I do think that taking a proactive and strategic approach to your fundraising efforts and how you approach investors versus just getting your deck out to as many people as possible, any way possible, is going to pay dividends for you as a founder.
Fair enough. Thank you for that, Benjie. And also, another final point here before we move on is obviously to keep somewhat control over your company and at least not too early give away too much control of the company that you have founded. And just the master, the sensei, if you will, of this must be Jason Robins of DraftKings. Obviously, $15 billion market cap, publicly traded. Jason owns something like 1.5% of DraftKings, but he retains 90% of the voting shares within DraftKings. Well done to Jason. So if we have Lord Danzig here. I guess we have Sensei Robbins on the DraftKings side. Something to learn
Yeah,
from
look,
him,
this
that's for
was
sure.
something that I think it was really Larry and Sergey at Google who pioneered, was this idea of, dual class voting shares where the founders retain, almost the entirety of the voting capabilities. And that has worked out quite well for the founders who have had the leverage, to negotiate that.
For sure. Guys, final part of today. As always here at Vested Interest, we try to do a deep dive on an interesting company. And today we will talk a little bit about Pinnacle Sports. And it's great, of course, to have Paris in the conversation here. I would say just like as a little bit of a backdrop and perhaps as a starting point here, we see a lot of tier 2 operators, especially on the European side, struggling at the moment. Obviously, as well on the US side, but we are seeing a lot of tier 2 operators struggling in Europe as well. Here in Malta, we've had a lot of redundancies lately, and even in Gibraltar, I heard actually this has not been reported yet in the time of this recording, but I heard that Mansion laid off just 400 people just the other day, like 1 or 2 days ago in Gibraltar. Big layoffs taking place in the industry, and obviously we are seeing more and more consolidation. And so perhaps as a starting point here, Paris, how does Pinnacle operate and succeed in this more and more difficult environment?
I think, there was a moment in time where everybody was focusing on growth because, it's almost like you're looking over in your neighbor's yard and all of a sudden they have this big garden and you're like, oh, where did they get that garden? So you got to add more to everything. And everybody was doing that, more departments. And then by nature of regulation, everybody had to grow substantially with responsible gaming, compliance, legal, all those other areas. So now it's all kind of coming back to reality. And I think people are looking at being more lean, being more efficient, not just spending money to spend money, but everything has to be from a high performance perspective. So with Pinnacle, there's Pinnacle, and then there's Pinnacle Solution, which is the API iframe more so, and then there's 10-Star. And when you talk about B2B, Magnus Hedman, this is his background, this is his DNA, which is why he was so keen to acquire Pinnacle so many years ago. That DNA of 10-Star is going to be very similar to that of Pinnacle. So when people are looking at B2B from a US standpoint, I think you're going to get the similarities of Pinnacle within that 10-Star product. I find it, and it's scalable because the core product of Pinnacle has its own, it has the different verticals, which has always been the long-term goal. So I think, that's how they are looking at it from a sustainability perspective and a growth perspective, is to scale better and also react to the market better. So, that core Pinnacle product is very unique, but there always will be differentiators into the B2B side.
Right, fair enough. I'm going to ask.
I don't know 100% what your question was.
Actually, can I jump in here?
I like it.
Pierre, can I jump in here? Maybe
go for it, Benjie.
Maybe I'll clarify even for people listening, and even maybe for mine and Lloyd's purposes. Can you tell us a bit more about 10-Star? And is 10-Star actually the Pinnacle B2B that you're referring to, or is it separate from Pinnacle B2B?
It's separate from Pinnacle B2B, and I think what you're going to see is different product. There's going to be a different type of product capability within the 10-Star product, which makes it unique and more innovative. But there's a lot of the insides of Pinnacle that has such a massive amount of value, the different algorithms that have been written for player profiling that can be extracted and reapplied, if you will, and when I say reapplied, not copy paste, but just taking those concepts and being more influential in a more in a regulated and recreational market. So, what Pinnacle would just use to operate, is an entire system that's missing within the U.S. market. People, you hear rumors about different abuse that happens with either the props or the micro betting, whatever it is. We have triggers in Pinnacle, like the things that are happening in the US market because of the longevity of Pinnacle and the experience that they have things in place to protect themselves. That these other, the US market, they're new. They don't have that. The European companies, they never had to protect themselves in that way. So I think it's going to be taking a lot of the concepts and recreating them for the 10-star model. And then also, it's not about having the best price 100%, because the reality is in the US market with the taxation of the different states and all the different issues that are there, the line has the value, which is proven by everybody copying it, to be fair. And then if you take that line and you add the risk management components, which is something that a lot of people are not, by copying, you're not getting the pure value, you're not maximizing your earn potential with the bets that are coming in, regardless if they're square or not. And then having that expertise on the 10-star side, I think, and having that understanding and access to that that experience that Pinnacle has just in nature by having the same owner. I think it's going to be a real, game changer is a bit of a strong word, but I do think it can be a game changer. And I won't go into some of the cool things that they were working on, but it's what I'd said earlier is those things that are just in the DNA. Other people don't have. I think the 10-star product will come out and really offer things that are going to help maximize the profit opportunities in the U.S. market as a partner.
Paris, I had a question. If I could turn back the clock even more to the earlier Pinnacle days, it feels to me, as an outside observer, that in the early days, Pinnacle made a name for itself by doing something that, I guess, when you describe it, sounds relatively simple, but actually no one else really did, which was welcome high volume, sharp action and pay out players in a timely fashion. Those should be the basics. That should, it feels like, be, table stakes, but alas, it was not. I guess, first of all, do you agree? Is it the case that part of how Pinnacle made a name for itself in the early days was really just by welcoming high volume action and paying out on time? And if that was the case, why don't you think everyone else did that? Why was that so unique? What was it about Pinnacle, either internally or otherwise, that made it so uniquely positioned to do what really should be the core functionality of any sports betting platform, and yet very clearly, even today, is actually not all that common at all?
Yeah. So timing is everything. And the component of high volume and paying out, that's great, but you're missing the low vig. And what that recipe of everything created was an opportunity to create something that has been, I haven't seen it being repeatable at this stage. So by having the high volume and the low vig, you're attracting the right information. Now, at this point, and back in the day, like when that came to fruition, people were reading newspapers. We had traders that got up at 3 a.m. to go through all of yesterday's results so they could formulate their model. The whole modeling thing, like that just came about more, and automating those lines. I think auto move is something Pinnacle had so many years ago that people never had. And that was just to protect the overnight lines, because something would go up on Don Best. And then you'd want to, if somebody hit it wrong, you just want to protect it until somebody woke up the next morning. But that was the premise of the success. And that was part of those early days with agents. And, that was a totally, the volumes were so astronomical because it wasn't, people just putting up $100 and betting $100. There was a lot more give within the system naturally. So, and I think those days are generally gone. And the days of a sports book having the right information and people betting that, what their gut is or what they've seen, those are gone. Everything is about models. Everything is about, the APIs and betting in automatically. The amount of bets that come in is just mind-blowing because it's not somebody sitting behind a computer placing a bet. It's, it's just every number's being popped at every second that there's any form of an arbitrage opportunity. But that is what has, and things have shifted. Then the next level, after there's no US market from 2006, was Asia. A whole new model. Like, back in the day, I think the agents got maybe 30, 60%. It depended upon what book they were with. And then the Asian market comes in and says, oh, by the way, we want 85. And everyone's like, huh? But they took all the risk, right? So it's just been such a cycle of different things, and everything is evolving. And I think what allows Pinnacle to maintain its success for so many years is the ability to pivot. Everybody in Asia was doing these massive volumes, and they were getting absolutely murdered by all these sharp bettors that had all these models that they couldn't compete against. And and we're like, wait a minute, let's not give away that much commission, because the volume, people that were getting volume commissions were making more money than any of us in the sports betting industry, on the operator side. So, we've had to pivot, and we're able to have partners and whatnot be helpful enough to help us understand where, there needs to be a shift in the industry, because technology has created something completely different from when I started in 1995 taking phone bets because they're on the phone, because there was no internet, to where we sit today in 2023.
It's really amazing.
Thank you.
I could easily jump back into some of the history stuff too, Paris, and I know we're running a bit short on time here, but I'll jump in also. Like, you talk about that pivot. So what about, like, you go 5 years ago, obviously betting is becoming regulated in a whole bunch of states, and then opportunities in Canada, and Pinnacle jumped into the Ontario market. What was some of the thought process for you when that moment came, when betting became more mainstream in the US? How did you think about it in terms of pivoting your company at that time to where we are today?
Yeah, well, that's where you have to say what matters to the organization and what will create that sustainability. So getting rid of any agent business, obviously, that was something that we had to do. And recognizing that when you want the masses, they really, and it's always hard for me to process, people don't care about the value. They really don't. And at least not, they're not betting $10,000 a game to care if the VIG is 106 or 104. They just really don't care. They just want to get the bet in. And now the experience that they have, and then there's content, and things are just shifting in such a way that, I think sometimes the sports books go into a box of what they're comfortable with and what they know and what they think, and they're not looking at what the consumers are requiring. And I keep saying, I think that the player experience, those companies that are focusing on that, they're the ones that are going to be excelling in the future. I'm still looking for that amazing experience that nobody understands. It's coming.
Thank you so much, Paris. Thank you so much, Paris. Lloyd Danzig, Benjie Cherniak, Paris Smith. It's been an excellent conversation here today. Thank you so much for coming on board today, Paris, as our special guest here. It's been brilliant. I wish you all the best in the future. And Lloyd and Benjie, we will see you here in the next episode. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.